The burning road. The desert doesn't care if you're a child. It takes what it wants: water from your body, strength from your limbs, hope from your heart. 14-year-old Ren Calder learned that truth 3 days ago when the wagon master abandoned them on this scorched stretch of nothing. Now she stands in torn canvas shade, knife pressed to a stranger's chest, 6 younger children cowering behind her. The baby hasn't cried in hours. That's worse than screaming. The man in front of her, tall, weathered, with dust coating his dark hair, doesn't move, doesn't speak, just watches her with eyes that have seen too much death. If you want to know whether Ren's blade draws blood or whether mercy exists in the Montana Badlands, stay with me until the end. And when this story grabs hold of your heart, hit that like button and comment what city you're watching from. I want to see how far this family's fight for survival reaches across the world. The sun had been a punishment for 3 days straight. Ren Calder had stopped counting hours somewhere around the second morning, when the canvas stretched across the broken wagon wheels began to smell like scorched fabric and desperation. She counted other things now. 6 children, besides herself. 2 canteens with maybe a cup of water between them. 1 knife with a blade that had already tasted blood once, when that drifter tried to climb into their shelter after dark. She'd cut him. Not deep, but enough. He'd left. The others hadn't understood why she'd let him go instead of finishing it. Boone, especially, had argued in that hard whisper he'd developed somewhere between the orphanage in Kansas and this godforsaken stretch of Montana territory. But Ren knew something Boone hadn't learned yet. Killing carried weight, the kind that bent your spine and changed your sleep. She'd carry the burden when she had to, but not before. "Ren," Mara's voice cracked on the single syllable. "Poppy's not moving right." Ren turned from the gap in the canvas where she'd been watching the empty road. The interior of their makeshift shelter trapped heat like a clay oven, and the 6 younger ones were arranged in whatever shade they could manufacture. Mara, 11 years old with braids coming loose from 3 days without proper care, held baby Poppy against her chest. The infant's face had gone from red to an awful grayish color, her small chest rising and falling too fast. Ren crossed the space in 2 steps and pressed her palm to Poppy's forehead. The skin burned. "She needs water," Kit said. He was 7, small for his age, with eyes too knowing for a child. "We all do." "We have water." Ren kept her voice level, even though her own tongue felt thick and her head pounded with each heartbeat. "We have half a cup," Eli corrected. He was 9, precise and logical, even when fear should have overridden reason. At current consumption rates, that gives us maybe 6 more hours before dehydration becomes critical for the smallest children. "Nobody asked you to do math." Boone's voice carried an edge that had been getting sharper each day. At 12, he was the second oldest, and he'd appointed himself Ren's opposition in everything. "What we need is to move. Find a town. Find water. Sitting here waiting is just dying slow." Ren met his eyes across the dim space. Boone's anger wasn't about her. She knew that. It was about the wagon master who'd taken their passage money and left them here when the axle broke. It was about the orphanage before that, and the father who'd sold him to it for drinking money. It was about a world that had taught him trust was for fools. She couldn't blame him for any of it. "We move. We die faster," Ren said. "You want to carry Poppy and Lena across open desert? They won't make it a mile." Lena, Mara's 8-year-old sister, hadn't spoken since the wagon master left. She sat in the corner, arms wrapped around her knees, rocking slightly. Whatever had broken in her when the adults abandoned them again hadn't healed yet. "So we just wait for someone to find us?" Boone pushed to his feet, though the canvas ceiling forced him to hunch. "What if nobody comes? What if the next person who shows up is worse than the last one?" Ren touched the knife at her belt. "Then I'll handle it. You can't fight everyone. Watch me." The sound of hoofbeats cut through their argument like a blade through silk. Ren's hand went to her knife as she moved to the canvas gap. A single rider approached from the east, outlined against the brutal glare of afternoon sun. Man-shaped, but details lost in the heat shimmer rising from the packed earth road. "Everyone quiet," Ren whispered. "Mara, get Poppy to the back. Boone, if this goes wrong, you take the little ones and run north. There were cottonwoods that way, maybe a creek." I'm not leaving you. You will if I tell you to. She didn't look at him, kept her eyes on the approaching rider. Your job is them, not me. Understand? He didn't answer, but she heard him move to position himself between the younger children and the entrance. The rider drew close enough for details to emerge. Tall man on a dun-colored horse, broad-brimmed hat shadowing his face. Clothes dusty but well-made. No visible weapons, but that meant nothing. Men who knew violence didn't always advertise it. He stopped 30 feet from their shelter, didn't dismount. For a long moment, he just sat there, still as the heat-stunned air around them. Then he spoke, and his voice carried clear and low. You're the children from the broken wagon. Not a question. Ren's fingers tightened on her knife handle. Keep riding. You need water. Still not a question. He turned slightly in his saddle and she saw the canteens hanging there. 3 of them, full enough to slosh. We don't need anything from you. The baby does. The words hit like a fist. Ren's chest tightened because he was right, and they both knew it. Poppy needed water more than pride, more than caution, maybe more than safety. Leave the canteens and go, Ren said. The man, she could see him better now, maybe 30 years old with a face carved by wind and sun and something harder than weather, shook his head slowly. Can't do that. I've got a knife, and I know how to use it. I believe you. He shifted his weight, and his horse took 3 steps closer. Ren pulled her blade, held it where he could see the steel catch sunlight. He stopped. But that baby's showing signs of severe dehydration. She needs water, shade, and probably a doctor. You're at least 8 miles from anything resembling a town. You think you can carry her that far in this heat? We'll manage. No, he said, quiet and certain. You won't. Ren wanted to argue, wanted to throw his truth back in his face, but Poppy's gray skin and shallow breathing made a liar of her pride. She stood there, knife raised, while the arithmetic of survival calculated itself behind her eyes. The man seemed to read the moment. He dismounted slowly, hands visible, movements telegraphed. My name's Rafe Mercer. I've got a ranch about 3 miles northwest. Good well, solid roof, enough space for all of you. Why would you help us? Something moved across his face, too quick to name. Because nobody helped me when I needed it, and I remember what that cost. Pretty words don't mean much. No, he agreed. They don't. He pulled one canteen from his saddle and held it out, arm extended, still 10 feet away. But water does, and I've got it. Question is whether your pride's worth more than that baby's life. The words were cruel because they were true. Ren's hand shook slightly on the knife handle. Behind her, she heard Poppy's rattling breath, heard Mara's soft crying, heard Boone's angry silence that said he knew exactly what choice she was about to make and hated every piece of it. You try anything, Ren said, voice hard as sun-baked clay, and I'll put this blade between your ribs. I don't care how big you are or what you think you're offering. Clear? Clear. Rafe took another step forward, canteen still extended. Though I should mention I'm not the one you need to convince. They are. He nodded toward the shelter. They're the ones who'll have to trust me enough to walk to my ranch. Ren took the canteen. Their fingers didn't touch, but she felt the weight of water transfer between them like a contract signed in liquid and desperation. She wanted to drink, wanted to pour the whole thing down her burning throat, but she turned and carried it to Mara instead. Small sips for Poppy, she said. Then everyone else gets one mouthful. Make it last. Mara's hands trembled as she tilted water to the baby's cracked lips. Poppy coughed, sputtered, but swallowed. The gray in her skin didn't change immediately, but her breathing steadied slightly. Ren returned to the entrance where Rafe stood, patient as stone. 3 miles? Northwest. There's shade most of the way if we follow the creek bed. And when we get there? Food. Water. Beds if you want them. Questions can wait until you're all hydrated and not half dead from heat. Boone appeared at Ren's shoulder, jaw set. What's to stop you from locking us in once we're there? Selling us off like the last bastard tried to do? Rafe looked at the boy for a long moment. Nothing, he said finally. Nothing except my word, which I know means less than nothing to you right now. So here's what I'll offer instead. I'll walk. Horse carries the baby and the smallest ones. You all stay armed with whatever you've got. First sign I'm not what I say, you run. I won't chase. Why walk? Eli asked, analytical even now. You could ride faster. Because trust moves at the speed of the slowest person, Rafe said. And right now, that's all of us. Ren studied his face, looking for the lie, the crack, the thing that would tell her this was another trap in a long line of traps that made up their lives. But his eyes were steady, and Poppy's breathing was still too shallow, and the sun wasn't going to get less brutal just because she wanted more time to decide. Everyone gather what you can carry, she said without looking away from Rafe. We walk together. Nobody falls behind. Ren, Boone started. I know. She finally turned to him. But we're out of choices that don't involve dying here. So we take the gamble. They assembled outside the canvas shelter like survivors of a shipwreck, blinking in the harsh light. 7 children between 14 and 10 months old, plus Rafe and his horse. Ren counted them automatically, the way she'd been counting them since the wagon master left. Boone, Mara, Eli, Lena, Kit, Poppy, all still breathing, all still hers to protect. Rafe lifted Poppy with careful hands, settled her in a sling he fashioned from his bedroll. Mara protested until Ren touched her shoulder. She needs to stay cool and still, Ren said quietly. You can walk beside her. They started northwest, and the sun tracked their progress like a predator watching prey. Rafe walked point, leading his horse with Poppy secured to the saddle. Ren took rear guard, knife still in her hand, eyes tracking Rafe's every movement. Between them, the other children struggled forward with the determination of those who'd survived worse than heat. The creek bed Rafe mentioned was dry, but its carved banks offered thin strips of shade. They stopped every quarter mile, passed around the second canteen Rafe offered, kept moving before muscles could stiffen or courage could fail. Kit stumbled on loose rock. Rafe caught him before Ren could move, steadied the boy with one hand while maintaining his grip on the horse's lead. Kit flinched from the touch but didn't pull away, too exhausted for proper fear. Easy, Rafe said. Watch the shale here. It shifts. I'm fine. Kit jerked free, pride damaged. I know you are. Rafe's voice carried no judgment. But the rocks don't care how tough you are. They'll roll either way. They walked on. Ren watched how Rafe moved, economical, aware, checking on Poppy every few minutes without making it obvious. He didn't talk much, didn't press for conversation or details, just led them forward with the certainty of someone who knew exactly where he was going. An hour into the walk, Lena fell. She went down hard on her knees, and the sound that came out of her was the first vocalization she'd made in 3 days, a small, wounded noise that cut through the heat-thick air. Mara dropped beside her sister immediately, hands fluttering over scraped knees. Lena, it's okay. You're okay. But Lena had started crying, and once the tears began, they didn't stop. Great hitching sobs that shook her small frame while Mara held her and Ren stood there feeling helpless because she didn't know how to fix whatever was broken inside that 8-year-old heart. Rafe stopped walking, turned, assessed the situation with those quiet eyes that seemed to see more than they should. We can rest here, he said. We need to keep moving. Ren hated how her voice shook. If we stop now, she needs to stop now. Rafe crouched near the sisters but didn't touch, gave them space. There's a rocky outcrop about 50 yards ahead, good shade. We'll take water, rest for 10 minutes. You said 3 miles. I did. We'll make it, but not if we break someone trying to force the pace. Ren wanted to argue, wanted to push forward on pure will and fury, but Lena's crying and Mara's desperate attempts to comfort her and the exhausted slump of Kit's shoulders made the decision for her. They rested in the shade of ancient stone, and Rafe pulled jerky from his saddlebag, distributed it with the same careful fairness he'd shown with water. The children ate like they'd been taught not to trust tomorrow's meals, fast and furtive, guarding their portions. Eli studied Rafe with open calculation. Why do you live alone out here? Eli, Ren started, but Rafe shook his head. It's a fair question. He chewed jerky, swallowed, considered his answer. I like the quiet, and the land doesn't ask questions I don't want to answer. That's not really an answer, Eli pressed. No, Rafe agreed. It's not. Boone snorted. See? He's hiding something. Everyone's hiding something, Rafe said mildly. Question is whether what I'm hiding is dangerous to you, and it's not. How do we know that? Rafe met Boone's challenging stare. You don't. Same way I don't know whether that knife your friend's carrying has tasted blood or if she's bluffing. We're all taking risks here. Difference is, I'm the one offering food and water while you're deciding whether to trust it. The logic was sound enough that even Boone couldn't immediately argue. He settled into sullen silence instead, watching Rafe the way a dog watches a stranger who might kick or might not. When they resumed walking, Lena's crying had subsided to occasional hitching breaths. Mara held her hand, and they moved forward together, two sisters against the brutal Montana sun. The ranch appeared like a mirage at first, wavering structures that might have been wishful thinking taking shape. But as they drew closer, the building solidified into reality. A low ranch house built from stone and timber, a barn that had seen better years but still stood square, a well with an actual roof over it, corrals empty of livestock but solid. Wren stopped at the property line, suddenly uncertain. The buildings looked real, permanent, the kind of place that suggested someone had put down roots and meant to stay. This is yours? She asked. Was my brother's, Rafe said. He left it to me when he died. Sorry for your loss. The words came automatic, the same thing people had said when her own parents died, when the sickness took them and left her with siblings to raise and no money to do it with. It was 5 years ago. Rafe's voice stayed level. Long enough that the grief doesn't ambush me anymore. Mostly. He led them to the well first, drew up bucket after bucket of cold, clean water while the children drank with single-minded desperation. Wren made them stop after the second cup each, knowing too much too fast would make them sick, but the transformation was already visible. Color returning to faces, breathing deepening. Lena's crying stopped entirely as she splashed water on her face. The house interior was sparse but clean, furniture that served function over beauty, a stone fireplace that dominated one wall, windows positioned to catch cross breeze. Rafe settled Poppy on a bed in the main room, and Mara took up station beside her like a sentinel. There's a room in back with 2 beds, Rafe said to Wren. Girls can take that. Boys can have the loft if they don't mind the latter. I'll sleep in the barn. Why? He looked at her with something that might have been surprise. Because you're children alone with a stranger, and the least I can do is give you space to feel safe. The consideration in his words landed oddly, a kindness she hadn't expected and didn't quite know how to accept. We don't need, I know what you need, Rafe said, not unkindly. And it starts with distance between you and me until you decide I'm not a threat. So, girls in back, boys in loft, me in barn. Food's in the pantry. Help yourselves. I'll bring fresh milk in the morning if you're still here. If? Boone caught the word. You think we're leaving? I think you'll do what you need to do to survive, Rafe said. Same as always. If that means staying, stay. If it means running, run. Either way, it's your choice. He walked out before any of them could respond, boots heavy on the wooden floor, door closing with a soft click that somehow felt more final than a slam would have. The children stood in the sudden silence, looking at each other with the same question reflected in 7 sets of eyes. What now? We eat, Wren decided. Then we figure out what happens next. The pantry held more food than they'd seen in months. Dried beans, flour, cornmeal, coffee, sugar, salt pork, canned goods with labels still legible. Wren's hand shook as she pulled down supplies, and she hated the shake, hated the evidence of just how close they'd been to disaster. Mara cooked. She had a gift for it, could make something approaching edible out of almost nothing. Tonight she made beans and cornbread, and the smell alone was enough to make Kit weep quietly into his sleeve. They ate at the scarred wooden table, and nobody spoke because speaking would have meant acknowledging how good it felt to have full bellies, clean water, walls around them. Acknowledging that would mean admitting they wanted to stay, and wanting things had a way of making the loss hurt worse when it came. After dinner, Wren checked Poppy. The baby's color had improved, her breathing normalized. Mara had been sponging her with cool water, and the fever seemed to have broken. She's going to be okay, Mara whispered, like saying it too loud might jinx the miracle. Yeah. Wren touched Poppy's tiny hand, felt the small fingers curl reflexively. She is. Because of him. Mara's eyes went to the window where they could see lamplight in the barn. Rafe, he saved her. Maybe. Not maybe. Definitely. Mara's voice got fierce. She was dying, Wren. You know she was. And he showed up with water and brought us here, and he's sleeping in the barn so we don't feel scared, and maybe he's exactly what he seems, Wren finished quietly. Or maybe he's just better at the long game than the other bastards we've met. Either way, we don't drop our guard. Understood? Mara's face fell, but she nodded. Later, when the girls were settling into the back room and the boys were climbing to the loft, Wren took her knife and walked outside. The night had brought relief from the heat, and stars scattered across the sky with the kind of abundance that only existed far from cities. She found Rafe in the barn, bedroll spread in an empty stall. He'd been reading by lamplight, an actual book with worn pages. He looked up when she appeared, but didn't speak first. "What do you want from us?" Wren asked. No preamble, no polite dancing around the question. Rafe closed his book, marked the page with his thumb. Nothing. Everyone wants something. Not from children, I don't. Then why help? She moved closer, knife still in her hand but held loose now. Why bring us here? Feed us. Give up your own bed. What's the angle? For a long moment, Rafe just looked at her. Then he said, 5 years ago, my brother died. Influenza. Simple, common, killed him in 3 days. I was off in Wyoming buying cattle, and by the time I got word and made it back, he was already buried. He died alone in this house because I wasn't here, and because our nearest neighbor is 10 miles off, and because this territory is hard on people who don't have anyone watching their back. He paused, and something old moved across his face. After the funeral, I came back here and lived by myself for 6 months. Didn't see another person for weeks at a time. And somewhere in that silence, I figured out that dying alone is one thing, but living alone is worse. It's slower, quieter. It hollows you out from the inside until you're just going through motions without remembering why. So we're what? Your cure for loneliness? Wren's voice came out harder than she meant it. No. Rafe's answer came quick and certain. Your children who needed help, and I was in a position to give it, that's all. Tomorrow you can leave or stay, your choice. If you stay, I'll help you figure out what comes next. If you go, I'll give you supplies for the road. Either way, no strings, no debt, no expectations. Wren wanted to find the lie in his words, wanted to peel back the careful phrasing and find the trap underneath, but his eyes were steady, and his voice didn't waver, and exhaustion was making it hard to maintain the edge of suspicion she'd been living on for 3 days. I'm going to sleep with my knife, she said. I'd be disappointed if you didn't. And if you come anywhere near that house tonight, you'll gut me. Rafe nodded. Understood. Though for what it's worth, I sleep like the dead and snore like a bear. Anyone within 50 feet will hear me coming. Despite herself, despite everything, Wren almost smiled. Almost. She walked back to the house, and this time when she climbed into the bed beside Lena and Mara, she let herself close her eyes. The knife stayed in her hand, but sleep came anyway, deep and dark and dreamless. In the barn, Rafe extinguished his lamp and settled into his bedroll. Through the open door, he could see the house where 7 children slept under a solid roof for the first time in days. He listened to the night sounds, wind through grass, horses shifting in the corral, the distant call of an owl hunting. Tomorrow would bring its own problems. Tomorrow, there would be questions about guardianship, about law, about what happened to children with no parents in a territory that barely had courts. Tomorrow, he'd have to figure out how to help without overstepping, how to offer shelter without creating dependence. But tonight, the baby's breathing was steady, and the children were safe, and that was enough. He closed his eyes and slept, and for the first time in 5 years, the silence didn't feel quite so heavy. Morning came with the smell of coffee and something Wren couldn't immediately identify, bread maybe, or biscuits. She woke with her knife still gripped in her hand and sunlight streaming through windows she hadn't closed the curtains on because she'd wanted to see anyone approaching. The bed beside her was empty, both Mara and Lena already gone, and for 3 seconds pure panic seized her chest before she heard voices from the main room. She found all 6 of them gathered around the kitchen table. Rafe stood at the stove flipping something in a cast-iron skillet, while the children watched him with the wary attention of those trying to decipher whether this was real or just another version of the traps they'd learned to expect. "Coffee's hot," Rafe said without turning. "Cups are in the cabinet to your left." Wren poured herself a cup, black and strong enough to strip paint. The first sip burned all the way down and cleared the sleep fog from her brain. She studied the scene, Poppy in Mara's arms, looking pink and healthy instead of gray and dying. Eli at the table with a book open in front of him, already reading. Kit pressed close to Boone's side in that way he had when he needed reassurance but wouldn't ask for it. Lena still quiet but at least present, watching Rafe's movements with dark, careful eyes. "Flapjacks," Rafe said, answering the question Wren hadn't asked. "And bacon. Figure you're all still hungry from yesterday." He wasn't wrong. When he set the food on the table, the children fell on it with slightly better manners than the night before, but the same desperate efficiency. Wren forced herself to eat slowly, to stay alert, to watch for whatever tell would reveal Rafe's true intentions. It didn't come. He ate his own breakfast standing at the counter, refilled coffee cups when they emptied, and didn't ask a single question about where they'd come from or where they were going. The silence should have felt comfortable. Instead, it felt like waiting for a storm that hadn't broken yet. After breakfast, Boone pushed back from the table. "So what happens now?" Rafe rinsed his plate in the basin, dried his hands on a towel. "That depends on what you want to happen. We want to not be here when you decide to cash in on whatever this is." Boone's voice carried the hard edge of someone who'd been disappointed too many times to believe in generosity. "Fair enough." Rafe pulled a leather pouch from a shelf, set it on the table. The coins inside clinked softly. "There's $40 there, enough to get you to the next town with some left over. You can walk out that door right now if that's what you choose." Wren stared at the money. $40 was more than she'd seen in her entire life. Enough to buy passage somewhere, maybe even enough to rent rooms for a few weeks while they figured out what came next. It was freedom in a leather pouch, and Rafe was offering it without conditions. "Why?" The word came out rough. "Why give us anything?" "Because you need it, and I have it to give." Rafe met her eyes. "But before you make up your mind, there's something you should know. Yesterday, while you were resting, I rode into town, talked to the sheriff about 7 children abandoned on the territorial road." Every muscle in Wren's body went tight. Beside her, Boone half rose from his chair. I told him I'd taken in some children who needed help," Rafe continued, voice level. "And I asked what the legal requirements were for temporary guardianship in Montana territory. Turns out it's complicated. There's paperwork, and there's a judge who has to approve it, and there's a whole process that takes time." "You had no right," Wren started, but Rafe held up a hand. "I also learned that abandoned children become wards of the territory, which means they get sent to institutions. Orphanages, if there's space. Work farms, if there's not. The sheriff mentioned a place about 60 miles south, run by a man named Reverend Sloan. Said he takes in displaced children, teaches them trades, finds them homes." The way Rafe said it made something cold slide down Wren's spine. "You don't believe that?" "I believe that's what the Reverend tells people. What I don't believe is that it's the whole truth." Rafe pulled out a chair, sat down like he was settling in for a long conversation. "See, I've been in this territory 5 years. I pay attention. And I've noticed that children go to Reverend Sloan's home, but they don't seem to come back out. No adoption announcements. No families claiming to have taken in orphans from his care. Just children disappearing into that compound and never being seen again." "Maybe they got sent somewhere else," Eli said, logical even in his fear. "Maybe he places them in other territories." "Maybe." Rafe's voice said he didn't think so. "Or maybe Reverend Sloan has found a legal way to acquire free labor and call it charity. Either way, that's where the sheriff will send you if he finds out you're here without a guardian." Mara's arms tightened around Poppy. "We're not going there." "No," Rafe agreed. "You're not. Which brings me back to the choice you need to make. You can take that money and run. Try to stay ahead of the system. Hope you make it somewhere before winter hits, and hope is all you've got between you and freezing." He paused, let the weight of that truth settle. "Or you can stay here. I'll file for temporary guardianship. It won't be fast and it won't be simple, but Judge Hart is a reasonable man. He'll want to see that you're being properly cared for, and he'll want to hear from you directly that this is what you want. If we can prove that, he'll likely approve it. And if he doesn't? Wren asked. Then we deal with that when it happens. But at least you'll have had a roof over your heads and food in your bellies while we tried. Boone laughed, sharp and bitter. You expect us to believe you're just going to take care of 7 kids out of the goodness of your heart? Nobody does that. There's always a price. You're right, Rafe said, and the agreement seemed to surprise Boone more than an argument would have. There is a price. The price is I'll expect you to pull your weight. This is a working ranch. The cattle are out on summer range right now, but they'll need to be brought in come fall. There's repairs that need doing, fences that need mending, a garden that could feed us all if someone tends it. I can't do it alone, and I won't pretend I can. So we'd be working for you. Wren's voice went flat. Labor for room and board. You'd be working with me, Rafe corrected. There's a difference. I'm not going to stand over you with a whip. I'm not going to punish you for being children who don't know ranch work yet. But I will expect honest effort, and I will teach you what you need to know to survive out here. Because this territory doesn't care about your intentions or your past. It only cares whether you're strong enough and smart enough to make it through next winter. The children looked at each other, that silent communication Wren had seen develop over their weeks together. Mara's eyes said she wanted to stay, wanted the safety of walls and water, and someone who seemed to give a damn whether they lived or died. Eli's expression calculated odds and outcomes with the precision of an engineer designing a bridge. Kit leaned into Boone, needing his older brother's strength. Lena watched it all with those dark, quiet eyes that saw too much and said nothing. Boone's face was the hardest to read, pride and suspicion, warring with the exhausted hope of someone who'd been running too long. Wren looked at the money on the table, then at Rafe's weathered face, then at the children who'd become her responsibility when the adults in their lives had failed them one by one. We need to talk, she said, privately. Rafe nodded, stood. I'll be outside checking the well pump. Take your time. He walked out, and the moment the door closed, Boone exploded. We can't seriously be considering this. He's a stranger. We don't know him. We don't know what he really wants. He wants help with his ranch, Eli said. He stated it clearly. The cost-benefit analysis actually makes sense from his perspective. 7 children represent significant labor potential, especially if he trains us in necessary skills. He wants free workers, Boone shot back, just like every other bastard who's ever offered us something. He offered us money to leave, Mara pointed out quietly. If he just wanted labor, why give us the choice? Because it's a trap. Make us think we're choosing, make us feel like we owe him, and then when we're dependent, show his real colors. Wren held up a hand. Everyone stop. Boone, I hear you. You're not wrong to be suspicious. But look at Poppy. Really look at her. They all turned to where the baby drowsed in Mara's arms, healthy pink replacing yesterday's death gray. She was dying, Wren continued, voice low and hard. We all know it. Another day in that wagon and we'd be burying her in rocks because we don't have tools to dig proper graves. Rafe saved her life. That's fact, not opinion. So we owe him? Boone's hands clenched into fists. Is that what you're saying? I'm saying we make decisions based on what's real, not what we're afraid might happen. What's real is winter's coming. What's real is we have no money, no skills, and 7 mouths to feed. What's real is the alternative to staying here is running until we can't run anymore, and then hoping whatever finds us is better than what we left behind. Kit spoke up, voice small. I'm tired of running. The simple statement hit harder than any argument. Kit, who never complained, who took every blow and kept moving, admitting exhaustion like it was a confession. I know, buddy. Wren crouched beside his chair. I know. What do you think? Mara asked. Really think, not what you think we need to hear. Wren stood, looked out the window to where Rafe worked on the pump, his movements economical and focused. I think he's telling the truth. I think he's lonely, and he sees a way to solve his problem and ours at the same time. I think he'll work us hard because that's what survival out here requires. And I think if we're smart and we're careful, this might be the best chance we get. And if you're wrong, Boone pressed, Then we run. We take that money and we go, and we've at least had a few days of rest and full bellies before we do. But Boone, we can't live our whole lives waiting for the knife. Sometimes you have to trust someone, even if it scares you. Trust gets you killed. So does being alone. Ren met his eyes. Indeed, your choice is your choice. But I'm staying, at least long enough to see if this is real. The silence stretched, weighted with all the decisions that had led them to this moment. Then, slowly, the others nodded. Mara first, then Eli with his careful logic, then Kit, who just looked relieved. Even Lena, who hadn't spoken, gave a small inclination of her head. Boone stood alone in his resistance, and Ren watched him wrestle with it. Pride against pragmatism. Suspicion against the faint, fragile possibility that maybe, just once, an adult was telling the truth. "Fine," he said finally, voice rough. "But I'm watching him. Any sign this goes wrong." "We run," Ren agreed. "All of us. Together." She retrieved the leather pouch from the table, walked outside to where Rafe had the pump disassembled on the ground. He looked up when her shadow fell across his work. "Keep your money," Ren said, holding out the pouch. "We're staying, for now." Something shifted in Rafe's expression. Not quite relief, not quite satisfaction. Something quieter and more complicated. "All right then. First thing you should know is how this pump works, because if it breaks in winter, knowing how to fix it might mean the difference between making it till spring and not." He launched into an explanation of seals and valves and pressure that went mostly over Ren's head, but she listened anyway, because this was the price of staying, learning to be useful in ways she'd never needed before. The others drifted out gradually. Eli asked technical questions that Rafe answered with unexpected patience. Mara carried Poppy in the shade and hummed old songs. Kit and Boone investigated the barn, though Boone's tension was visible in every line of his body. Lena stood apart, watching it all with those dark eyes that carried too much weight for 8 years old. Rafe noticed. "You like horses?" Lena didn't answer, but her gaze shifted to the corrals. "I've got 3, Rafe continued, talking to her the way you'd talk to a spooked animal, low and easy, no pressure. "The dun gelding you saw yesterday, a bay mare who's gentle as they come, and a paint stallion who thinks he's tougher than he is. Mare's name is Copper. You want to meet her?" Lena's hesitation lasted a long moment. Then she nodded, just once. Rafe stood, wiped his hands on his pants. "Come on, then." Ren watched them walk to the corral together. Rafe's long strides shortened to match Lena's smaller steps. He didn't try to hold her hand, didn't push for conversation, just opened the gate and led her to where a copper-colored mare stood dozing in morning sun. "This is Copper," Rafe said. "She's 12 years old, which is getting up there for a horse, but not ancient. She likes carrots and having her ears scratched, and she's patient with people who don't know horses yet." Lena reached out slowly, touched the mare's shoulder. Copper turned her head, huffed soft breath across the girl's hair, and went back to dozing. Something in Lena's face changed, not quite a smile, but the ghost of what a smile might become if given time and safety. Ren felt her throat tighten. This was why she'd agreed to stay, she realized. Not for herself, but for that almost smile on Lena's face, for Kit's relief, for Poppy's healthy breathing and Mara's hopeful eyes, for the chance that maybe they could stop surviving long enough to start living. The first week passed in a blur of learning. Rafe set them to tasks suited to their abilities. Eli helped with mechanical repairs, his precise mind perfect for puzzles of function and failure. Mara took over the kitchen and turned simple ingredients into meals that tasted like comfort. Kit learned to gather eggs from chickens that Rafe admitted he'd been neglecting. Boone threw himself into physical labor with the fury of someone trying to outrun his own thoughts, chopping enough wood to last 2 winters. Ren learned everything: how to mend fence, how to read weather, how to tell good water from bad, how to shoot the rifle Rafe taught her to handle with respect bordering on reverence. She learned that Rafe woke before dawn and worked until dark, that he was patient with honest mistakes but had no tolerance for carelessness, that he said little but noticed everything. She also learned that he kept his word. He slept in the barn every night, never entered the house without knocking, never touched the children without permission, gave them space and time and the freedom to decide each day whether to stay or go. The money sat on the kitchen shelf, unclaimed and available. On the 8th day, a rider came. Wren saw the dust first, the way she'd learned to watch for approaching strangers. She was mending fence with Rafe when the man on a black horse crested the rise, and she felt Rafe go still beside her. "That's Sheriff Cole," he said quietly. "I expected him sooner." Wren's hand went to the hammer on her belt, as close to a weapon as she could carry while working. "What do we do?" "We talk to him, answer his questions. Don't lie, but don't volunteer more than he asks. And Wren, stay calm. Running now would only confirm whatever suspicions brought him here." The sheriff was a thick man with gray at his temples and eyes that assessed everything. He dismounted in the yard, nodded to Rafe. "Mercer?" "Sheriff." "What brings you out?" "Heard you've taken in some children. Wanted to see for myself that everything's appropriate." His gaze found Wren, took in her work-rough clothes, the hammer in her hand, the wariness in her stance. "You one of them?" "Yes, sir." Wren kept her voice level. "How old are you?" 14. "Where are your parents?" "Dead. Influenza, 2 years back." The sheriff's expression didn't change. "And the others?" "How many of you are there?" 7 total. Me, my 2 brothers, 2 sets of sisters, and a baby. That's a lot of children for one man to take responsibility for. The sheriff's attention shifted to Rafe. "What's your interest here, Mercer?" "They needed help. I was in a position to provide it." "Just out of the goodness of your heart? Is there another reason I should need?" Rafe's voice stayed even, but Wren heard steel underneath. "Territory's hard on children alone. Harder when winter comes. Seemed like the right thing to do. The right thing would be to notify proper authorities. Let the territorial system handle placement." "You mean send them to Reverend Sloane's home?" Something flickered in the sheriff's eyes. "The Reverend runs a respectable operation." "I'm sure he does." Rafe's tone suggested he believed nothing of the kind. "But these children are settled here. They're fed, clothed, learning useful skills. Seems to me that's exactly what the system would want for them. What the system wants is proper oversight, legal guardianship, documentation. I filed the paperwork with Judge Hart 3 days ago. He's reviewing it." The sheriff's jaw tightened. "You should have contacted me first." "Why?" The question came quiet and dangerous. "So you could pull them out of a safe situation and send them to a man I don't trust? No thank you, Sheriff. I'll take my chances with the judge." For a long moment, the 2 men stared at each other, and Wren understood she was watching something that had nothing to do with law and everything to do with power and the ways it got exercised in places far from official oversight. Finally, the sheriff said, "I'll need to see all of them. Make sure they're being properly cared for." "They're around the property, working," Rafe raised his voice. "Everyone to the yard, please." They came from different directions. Eli from the barn where he'd been organizing tools, Mara from the house with Poppy on her hip, Boone from the woodpile with an axe still in his hand, Kit from the chicken coop with eggs in a basket, Lena from the corral where she'd been spending every free moment with Copper. The sheriff studied each of them with a lawman's eye for details. Wren knew what he saw, children who looked fed, clean, occupied, not pampered, but not abused, working hard, but not worked to death. "Any of you being mistreated?" the sheriff asked. "Speak up now if you are." Silence. Then Mara said, "He's teaching me to make real bread, with yeast and everything." "He's teaching me about gear ratios," Eli added, "and mechanical advantage." Kit just held up his basket of eggs, proud offering that needed no words. Boone said nothing, but he didn't contradict the others either. The sheriff's gaze landed on Lena, who stood slightly apart. "What about you, child? You being treated well?" Lena looked at Rafe, then at Wren, then back to the sheriff. And in a voice rusty from disuse but clear enough to hear, she said, "He lets me see the horses." The words hung in the air, precious because they were the first she'd spoken in over a week, valuable because they were true. Rafe's expression didn't change, but Wren saw his throat work like he was swallowing something too big for words. The sheriff heard it too, the weight of that simple statement. "All right then, but I'll be checking back, regular-like. And if I hear anything that suggests these children aren't being properly cared for, you'll do your duty," Rafe finished. "As you should. I wouldn't expect anything less." The sheriff mounted his horse, looked down at them all. "Judge Hart will want to interview each of you separately. Make sure this arrangement is voluntary, you understand?" Seven heads nodded. "And you," he said to Rafe, "you make sure those children get to town when the judge summons them. No excuses, no delays." "On my word." They watched the sheriff ride away, and when the dust settled, Boone turned to Rafe. "He'll be back." "Yes. And next time he might bring Reverend Sloane." "Possibly." "So what do we do?" Rafe looked at the 7 children standing in his yard, tools in their hands, dirt on their clothes, guarded hope in their eyes. "We keep doing what we're doing. We work. We learn. We prove that this arrangement benefits everyone involved. And when Judge Hart calls for us, we tell him the truth." "What if the truth isn't enough?" Wren asked. "Then we deal with that when it happens. But I've learned one thing in 5 years alone on this ranch. Worrying about tomorrow's storms while today's sun is shining is a good way to miss the chance to get the hay in while you can." It was practical wisdom that made sense, but Wren saw the calculation behind Boone's eyes, saw him measuring escape routes, counting supplies, planning for the day when running would be the only option left. She didn't blame him. She was doing the same math. That night, after dinner, after the dishes were washed and the children had settled into their respective spaces, Wren found Rafe in the barn again. He was working on leather, repairing a bridle with the focused attention he brought to all tasks. "What aren't you telling us?" she asked without preamble. Rafe's hand stilled on the leather. "What makes you think I'm not telling you something?" "Because the sheriff was barely civil to you. Because you filed guardianship papers without mentioning it until he showed up. Because there's something about Reverend Sloane that makes your voice go cold." She moved closer. "If we're going to stay here, if we're going to trust you, we deserve the whole truth." Rafe set down the bridle, looked at her with those quiet eyes that had seen too much. "Reverend Sloane came to this territory 6 years ago, set up his children's home with donations and moral authority. Says he's saving orphans, teaching them godly ways and honest labor. But children go in and don't come out. Not to families, not to apprenticeships, not anywhere that can be verified. And the few people who've asked questions have had accidents, house fires, riding accidents. One man drowned in a river he'd crossed 100 times before." Wren's blood went cold. "You're saying—" "I'm saying I have suspicions, but no proof. I'm saying the sheriff either doesn't see what I see or chooses not to look too close. I'm saying if Sloane gets hold of you 7, I don't know what would happen, but I don't think it would be good." "Then why bring us here? Why paint a target on yourself?" Rafe picked up the bridle again, ran his thumb over the stitching. "Because my brother died alone while I was off chasing profit instead of staying where I was needed. Because I spent 6 months wishing I could go back and make different choices. Because when I saw you standing in that wagon with a knife in your hand and 6 children behind you, I saw a chance to make at least one choice I wouldn't regret." The honesty in his voice stripped away Wren's last defenses. "We might get you killed." "We're all dying," Rafe said. "Question is what we do with the time between now and then. I'd rather spend it fighting for something that matters than hiding from everything that scares me." Wren stood there in the lamplit barn, breathing in the smell of leather and hay and honest sweat, and made a decision that would change all their lives. "Then we fight," she said. "Together." Rafe looked up, and for the first time since she'd met him, something like a smile touched his weathered face. "Together." The summons came 3 weeks later, delivered by a clerk who barely looked old enough to shave. Judge Hart wanted to see them all in his chambers on Thursday morning, 10 o'clock sharp, and the paper he handed Rafe had enough official seals on it to make the whole thing feel like walking toward a gallows with legal paperwork. Wren watched Rafe read the document twice, his face giving nothing away. When he looked up, his eyes found hers first. "Thursday. That's 2 days from now." "We'll be ready," she said, though she had no idea what ready meant in this context. "The judge will want to speak to each of you separately. He'll ask about living conditions, treatment, whether you feel safe here. Answer honestly, but understand that honesty can be used against us if someone wants to twist it that way." Boone, who'd been listening from the doorway, crossed his arms. "So we lie?" "No." Rafe's voice went hard. "You tell the truth, but you think about how you tell it. There's a difference between saying Rafe works us hard and saying Rafe teaches us skills we need to survive. Both are true. One makes me sound like a taskmaster, the other like a teacher." "That's still manipulation," Eli pointed out. "It's strategy," Rafe corrected. And it's what you'll need to understand if you want to make it in a world where words matter as much as actions. The judge is a fair man, but he's also a man who has to answer to the territorial government and the people who fund institutions like Reverend Sloan's. He'll be looking for reasons to either approve this arrangement or shut it down. You help him see what he needs to see. That night, Wren gathered the children in the main room after dinner. Rafe had made himself scarce, understanding that some conversations needed to happen without adult oversight, even adult oversight that was trying to help. "We need to be smart about this," she said without preamble. "The judge is going to ask questions, and our answers matter." So we rehearse. Mara held Poppy against her shoulder, the baby drowsy and milk drunk. "Practice what to say?" "Not rehearse. That'll sound fake. But we talk about the truth and how to say it so people hear what actually matters." Wren looked at each of them. "Kit, if the judge asks if you're happy here, what will you say?" Kit thought about it with the seriousness he brought to everything. "I'd say I like the chickens, and I'm not hungry anymore." "That's good. That's real." Wren turned to Eli. "What about you?" "I could explain the educational value of practical mechanical training and how it compares favorably to institutional settings that prioritize rote learning over applied knowledge." He paused at Wren's expression. "Or I could say I'm learning things I couldn't learn anywhere else." "Second one," Wren confirmed. "Mara?" "I'd tell him about the kitchen, how Rafe lets me cook and doesn't yell if I make mistakes, how he showed me the difference between baking bread and making it rise right." Her voice got softer. "How he sits with Poppy sometimes when I need to do things, and he's gentle with her even though he doesn't have to be." Lena, who'd been sitting quiet in the corner with her knees drawn up, spoke without being asked. "I tell him about Copper." The simple statement carried weight because Lena still spoke so rarely, each word a gift she gave deliberately. Wren nodded. "The judge will like that. It shows you're not afraid here." "What about me?" Boone's challenge came sharp. "What should I say? That I still don't trust any of this? That I watch the door every night expecting Rafe to show his real face? That would be honest. It would also guarantee we get split up and sent to Sloan's facility." Wren met his anger with steady calm. "I'm not asking you to lie about how you feel. I'm asking you to think about what serves us and what doesn't. You want to protect everyone here? Then help me keep us together." Boone's jaw worked, pride and pragmatism at war across his face. Finally he said, "I'll tell the judge that Rafe keeps his word, that he said he'd teach us to survive out here, and he's doing it. That's true enough." "It's more than true. It's what matters." Wren stood, paced to the window where she could see lamplight in the barn. "We're not a normal family. The judge knows that. But we can show him we're a real one, that we chose this, that we're better off here than anywhere else the territory might send us. And if he doesn't see it that way," Kit's voice carried the fear he usually kept buried, "then we deal with it." Wren forced confidence into her voice. "But we're not beaten until we stop fighting. Understood?" 7 heads nodded, though the worry didn't leave their eyes. Thursday morning arrived wrapped in gray clouds that threatened rain. Rafe hitched the wagon before dawn, and they loaded in with the careful silence of soldiers preparing for battle. The ride to town took 2 hours over rutted roads, and nobody spoke much beyond practical necessities. The town of Bridger Creek wasn't large, maybe 300 people when you counted the outlying ranches. Main Street held the essentials: general store, saloon, blacksmith, hotel, and at the end, a square building that served as both courthouse and land office. Judge Hart's chambers occupied the second floor, accessible by an external staircase that felt like climbing toward judgment. They waited in a narrow hallway that smelled of old paper and furniture polish. Wren counted the windows, 3, all facing the street, and marked the exits the way she'd learned to do in every new place. Boone stood against the wall, arms crossed, radiating tension. Mara kept Poppy quiet with soft humming. Eli read the notices posted on a board, probably memorizing every word. Kit pressed close to Wren's side. Lena sat on the floor in the corner, arms around her knees. Rafe stood separate, giving them space while staying close enough to matter. A door opened, and a woman with steel gray hair and a dress buttoned to her throat looked out. "Wren called her?" Wren's stomach dropped, but she kept her face neutral. "That's me. Judge Hart will see you first." She followed the woman into chambers that felt more like a library than a courtroom. Books lined 3 walls, and a massive desk dominated the space between them. Behind it sat a man in his 50s with a lined face and eyes that looked like they'd seen every variation of human nature and weren't impressed by most of it. "Miss Calder," he gestured to a chair. "Please, sit." Wren sat, spine straight, hands folded in her lap the way her mother had taught her when she was small and the world still made sense. Judge Hart studied her for a long moment. "You're 14 years old, responsible for 6 younger children, and you've chosen to place yourself under the guardianship of a man you've known for less than a month. Does that about sum it up?" "Yes, sir." "Help me understand why." Wren had rehearsed this moment in her head 100 times, but now that it was here, all the careful words disappeared. What came out was raw truth. "Because we were dying in that wagon, and he saved us. Because he keeps his word. Because in 3 weeks he's taught us more about surviving than anyone else ever bothered to. And because the alternative is getting sent to Reverend Sloane's home, and Rafe doesn't trust that place." "Rafe told you that?" "Yes, sir. He said children go in but don't come back out to families. He said he has suspicions but no proof." Judge Hart's expression didn't change, but something shifted in his eyes. "And you believe him?" "I believe he believes it. And I trust his judgment more than I trust a system that abandoned us on a broken wagon in the middle of nowhere." "The system didn't abandon you. A criminal did." "The system hired that criminal as a wagon master. The system took our passage money and put us in his care. The system failed us, sir, with all respect." Wren leaned forward slightly. "Rafe Mercer found us by accident and helped us by choice. That's more than the system's done." The judge leaned back in his chair, fingers steepled. "You're angry. I'm practical. There's a difference. Tell me about the living arrangements. Where do you sleep?" "The girls have a room in back of the house. 2 beds, clean linens, windows that lock from inside. The boys have the loft. Also clean, also secure. And Mr. Mercer? Sleeps in the barn. Has from the first night. Won't come in the house without knocking, won't touch any of us without permission. Gives us space to feel safe. But that's unusual behavior for a man claiming guardianship. It's respectful behavior from a man who understands we've got reasons not to trust adults." Wren held his gaze. "He's earning our trust instead of demanding it. That makes him different than most people we've met." Judge Hart made a note on the paper in front of him. "What does a typical day look like?" Wren walked him through it. Morning chores, lessons both practical and academic, because Rafe had books and insisted they keep reading, afternoon work on whatever the ranch required, evenings for dinner and quiet. She described Eli's fascination with mechanical systems, Mara's growing skill in the kitchen, Kit's careful tending of the chickens, Lena's slow emergence from silence through her connection with the horses. "And Boone?" the judge asked. "The second oldest. How is he adjusting?" "Boone doesn't trust easy, and he shouldn't. Life hasn't given him reasons to. But he works harder than anyone, and he hasn't tried to run, which tells me something." "What does it tell you?" "That maybe he's starting to believe this might be real." The judge made more notes, and Wren sat there wondering if she'd said too much or not enough, if honesty was helping or damning them. Finally, Judge Hart looked up. "I'm going to ask you a question, Miss Calder, and I want you to think carefully before you answer. If I were to tell you right now that this guardianship won't be approved, that you and the other children will be placed in Reverend Sloane's home, what would you do?" Wren didn't hesitate. "I'd take the children and run. Tonight. We'd be gone before morning. Even though running would make you fugitives, even though it would make your lives infinitely harder? Even though," she met his eyes, "because I promised to keep them safe, and I keep my promises, sir." Something that might have been respect crossed the judge's face. "Thank you for your honesty, Miss Calder. You can send in the next child." Wren stood, legs steadier than she expected. At the door, she paused. "Judge Hart? Rafe Mercer is a good man trying to do right by children nobody else wanted. I hope that matters to you." "It does," he said quietly. "More than you know." The interviews took 3 hours. Each child went in alone, came out silent, and wouldn't talk about what was asked until they were all finished. Through the window, Wren watched storm clouds gather, turning afternoon to premature dusk. When Lena emerged last, they all looked to Rafe. He'd been called in after the children, but before whatever final deliberation the judge required. His face gave nothing away. "Now we wait," was all he said. They waited in the wagon while rain started, light at first and then heavy enough to drum on the canvas cover Rafe had stretched overhead. The street emptied as people sought shelter, and the only sound was water and worry. The gray-haired woman appeared in the courthouse doorway, beckoned. They climbed out into the rain and back up those stairs that felt even more like judgment when wet. Judge Hart stood by his window, hands clasped behind his back. He didn't turn when they entered, just spoke to the rain-streaked glass. "I've been a territorial judge for 16 years. In that time, I've made decisions about hundreds of children, orphans, abandoned, seized from unfit parents. I've sent them to institutions, to foster families, to relatives who didn't want them, but took them anyway out of obligation." He turned, and his face looked older than it had 3 hours ago. "I've made mistakes. Sent children to places that looked proper on paper but weren't. Trusted people who presented well but had dark hearts. The law tries to protect the vulnerable, but it's a blunt instrument in delicate situations." Wren's chest tightened. This was refusal wrapped in philosophy, judgment delivered with regret. "However," Judge Hart continued, "I've also learned to recognize when something unusual is also something right. 7 children with no family finding refuge with a man who lost his brother. A rancher teaching survival skills because he understands that knowledge is the difference between living and dying in this territory. A makeshift family built from need and choice instead of blood and obligation." He picked up a paper from his desk, and Wren saw official seals, signatures, the weight of law made visible. "I'm granting temporary guardianship to Rafe Mercer for a period of 6 months. During that time, Sheriff Cole will make monthly visits to ensure proper care. At the end of 6 months, we'll reassess. If conditions remain acceptable, I'll make it permanent." The relief hit so hard Wren's knees went weak. Beside her, Mara made a sound between a laugh and a sob. Kit grabbed Boone's hand. Eli's precise face cracked into something approaching a smile. Lena's eyes went bright with tears she didn't shed. "Thank you," Rafe said, voice rough. "We won't disappoint you." "See that you don't." Judge Hart's expression hardened slightly. "And Mr. Mercer? I want you to understand something. This decision will not be popular. Reverend Sloan has friends in the territorial government. He provides a service the territory values, and he doesn't appreciate interference with what he considers his domain." "I understand. I'm not sure you do. The Reverend is a man who believes his work is godly and his methods beyond reproach. He doesn't take challenges well." Judge Hart handed the papers to Rafe. "Keep these children safe. Keep them together. And if you need help, you send word immediately. I may be the law, but I can't protect you if I don't know you're in danger." The warning settled cold in Wren's stomach. They'd won this battle, but the judge's words made it clear the war wasn't over. They left the courthouse as rain turned to downpour, and by the time they reached the wagon, they were all soaked through. Nobody cared. They climbed in and huddled under the canvas while Rafe drove through weather that turned the road to mud and made the horses work twice as hard. Halfway home, Boone spoke for the first time since the judgment. "Sloan's gonna come for us, isn't he?" Rafe didn't lie. "Probably." "When?" "I don't know, but we'll be ready." "How do you get ready for someone with government friends and legal authority?" "Same way you get ready for winter or drought or any other threat you can't prevent. You prepare for the worst and hope for the best. We make sure this place is defensible. We document everything. We prove that you're thriving here so thoroughly that anyone who tries to take you away looks like they're acting from malice instead of concern." Wren understood the strategy, but she also understood how fragile it was. Paper and precedent against power and connections. They were betting their lives that justice would prevail over influence, and history gave them little reason for confidence. The ranch appeared through the rain like a promise kept. They unloaded in the downpour, got the horses settled, stumbled into the house dripping and exhausted. Mara started coffee while Rafe built up the fire, and they all stood around the stove like survivors of a flood, counting their blessings while waiting for the next wave. "We should celebrate," Kit said suddenly. "We won. Shouldn't we celebrate?" Rafe looked at the boy, then at the others, then at the guardianship papers drying on the table. "Yeah, he said slowly. Yeah, we should. Mara made cornbread and beans, which was what she always made, but somehow tasted better tonight. They ate at the table, all of them together for the first time, including Rafe, who'd been taking his meals in the barn to give them space. It felt strange having him there, formal somehow, but also right in a way that was hard to name. After dinner, Eli asked the question they'd all been thinking. What happens if Reverend Sloane does come? What do we do? We stand our ground, Rafe said. We have law on our side now. Judge Hart granted guardianship. That means something. It means something until someone with more power decides it doesn't, Boone countered. Then we make sure they can't. Rafe's voice carried an edge Wren hadn't heard before. Tomorrow, we start documenting everything. Wren, you're good with words. You keep a journal of daily activities, lessons, progress. Eli, you inventory supplies and improvements. Mara, you track meals and nutrition. We create a record so detailed that anyone who questions this arrangement has to answer to facts, not assumptions. And if that's not enough, Wren pressed. Rafe met her eyes across the table. Then we fight. Whatever way we have to. That night, Wren lay awake listening to Mara and Lena breathe in the darkness. Through the window, she could see lamplight still burning in the barn, and she wondered if Rafe was sleeping or planning or just sitting with the weight of 7 children's lives now legally his responsibility. She must have dozed eventually because she woke to commotion. Horses in the yard, voices, the sound of Rafe's boots hitting wood as he came out of the barn. Wren grabbed her knife and moved to the window. Dawn was breaking gray and reluctant, and in the half-light she counted 5 riders. They sat their horses in a semicircle facing the barn, and even from a distance she recognized the attitude of men who'd come with purpose and weren't leaving without satisfaction. The one in front wore black, suit, hat, even his horse was dark as judgment. He had the kind of face that looked designed for certainty, all hard angles and no softness. When he spoke, his voice carried across the yard with the practiced projection of someone used to being heard. Rafe Mercer. I'm Reverend Josiah Sloane. I've come for the children. Wren's blood went cold. She turned from the window to find Boone already awake, already moving. Get everyone up, quietly. We might need to run. But even as she said it, she knew running wouldn't work, not with 5 men on horses against 7 children on foot. They were trapped, and Reverend Sloane knew it. Outside, Rafe stood in the barn doorway, and even from here Wren could see the tension in his shoulders. The children are under my legal guardianship. Judge Hart signed the papers yesterday. I'm aware of the judge's decision. I'm also aware it was made under false pretenses and emotional manipulation. Sloane's voice stayed level, reasonable, the kind of calm that made disagreement seem irrational. You've taken advantage of vulnerable children, Mr. Mercer, isolated them here, filled their heads with fears about the very institutions designed to help them. That ends today. I've done nothing but give them shelter and care. You've done what every predator does, created dependency, manufactured trust, positioned yourself as their only option. Sloane dismounted and the other 4 men followed his lead. I have a court order, signed by Territorial Administrator Walsh, authorizing the immediate transfer of these children to my care pending a full investigation into your suitability as guardian. Judge Hart has jurisdiction. Judge Hart is one man with limited authority. Administrator Walsh speaks for the territorial government. His word supersedes local judgment, particularly in matters involving child welfare. Sloane pulled a folded paper from his coat, held it up. This is legal and binding, Mr. Mercer. Resist, and you'll be arrested for obstruction and interference. The children will still come with me, but you'll be watching from a jail cell instead of your ranch. Wren saw the trap close like jaws around steel. Sloane had outmaneuvered them before they'd even known the game was being played. Legal authority from someone more powerful than Judge Hart, men with badges to enforce it, a moral high ground built from lies but polished enough to look like truth. Rafe stood there, and Wren could see him calculating odds, weighing options, looking for the move that would save them. But there wasn't one. Not that she could see, not that anyone could. I want to see that order, Rafe said finally. Sloane smiled, thin and cold. Of course, though I should warn you, legal challenges will take months. Months during which the children will remain in my care while the territorial government conducts its investigation. Months during which they'll be learning discipline, faith, and proper respect for authority. Boo! He walked forward, paper in hand, and behind him the four men fanned out like they'd practiced the formation. Everything about the moment felt rehearsed, professional, the execution of a plan that had been refined through repetition. Wren made a decision. She grabbed the knife from under her pillow, pulled on boots, and headed for the door. Behind her, Boone hissed, "Wren, don't!" But she was already outside, moving across the yard toward where Rafe and Sloane stood 10 feet apart. The Reverend's men turned toward her, hands going to weapons they wore openly, and Wren understood with cold clarity that these weren't missionaries or teachers. They were enforcers. "Miss Calder, I presume." Sloane's attention fixed on her with the focus of a hawk spotting prey. "The oldest. The one who appointed herself mother to this orphaned brood. I've read Sheriff Cole's report. Quite remarkable, really, how much responsibility you've taken on. Too much responsibility for a child. You should be in school, learning, growing, not playing guardian to 6 younger children." "I'm not playing anything." Wren stopped beside Rafe, knife visible in her hand. "And we're not going with you." "I'm afraid you don't have a choice, child. The law gave us to Rafe yesterday. Judge Hart signed papers. That makes this kidnapping, not rescue." Sloane's smile didn't waver. "Judge Hart lacks the authority to override territorial administration. This order supersedes his decision. Now you can come willingly, or my men can assist you. Either way, you're leaving this ranch today." "No." The word came from behind Wren. She turned to see all of them. Mara with Poppy, Eli, Kit, Boone, even Lena, standing in a line between the house and the men who'd come to take them. 7 children against 5 armed adults, hopeless odds made defiant through sheer refusal to surrender. "Children?" Sloane's voice carried disappointed patience. "You've been deceived, mister. Mercer has made you fear the very help you need. My home provides education, spiritual guidance, honest work that builds character. You'll have structure, discipline, purpose. Everything a child requires to become a productive member of society." "We have that here," Eli said, precise even in fear. "We have education and work and purpose. What we don't have is whatever you're really offering." "And what do you imagine I'm offering?" "Free labor," Boone snarled. "We've heard about your home, Reverend. Kids go in, they don't come out. You can dress it up in pretty words, but we know what you are." Sloane's expression hardened, the kindly mask slipping enough to show something colder underneath. "You've been poisoned against honest charity. That's tragic, but it can be remedied. With time and proper guidance, you'll understand that your resistance comes from fear, not wisdom." He gestured to his men. "Bring them to the wagons, gently but firmly. We'll sort out their belongings later." The men moved forward and Rafe stepped between them and the children. "You're not taking them." "Mr. Mercer, you're already facing charges of interference. Don't add assault to that list. Then you'll have to go through me to get to them." For a long moment, everyone stood frozen in tableau. Rafe blocking access to the children, Sloane's men poised to act, the children themselves ready to run or fight or die but refusing to go quietly. The morning sun broke through clouds like spotlight on a stage, and Wren thought wildly that if this was the last stand, at least they were making it together. Then hoofbeats shattered the standoff. 2 riders coming hard from the east, and as they got closer, Wren recognized Sheriff Cole, and behind him, incredibly, Judge Hart himself. They pulled up in the yard, horses lathered from hard riding. The judge dismounted with the stiff movements of someone unaccustomed to urgent travel but doing it anyway. "Reverend Sloane," his voice carried the weight of 16 years pronouncing judgment. "That order you're holding is invalid." Sloane's face went carefully neutral. "Judge Hart, I'm surprised to see you here. This matter falls under territorial administration. This matter falls under my jurisdiction as the presiding judge who granted guardianship yesterday. And that order from Administrator Walsh? I had Sheriff Cole ride to the territorial capital last night to verify it." He pulled his own paper from his coat. "Walsh never signed it. His signature is forged, which makes this attempted seizure not legal intervention, but criminal kidnapping." The words landed like stones in still water, ripples of implication spreading. Sloane's men looked at each other, uncertainty breaking their professional formation. Sloane himself stayed composed, But Wren saw calculation behind his eyes. That's impossible. I received this order through proper channels. You received a forgery through channels you control. Judge Hart's voice stayed level, but fury ran underneath like current in deep water. I don't know who signed that paper, Reverend, but it wasn't Walsh. I have a telegram from him confirming he issued no such order and wants to know who's using his authority without permission. This is clearly a misunderstanding. This is clearly an attempted kidnapping of children under legal protection. Sheriff Cole, arrest Reverend Sloan and his associates. Charges include forgery, attempted kidnapping, fraud, and interference with a lawful guardianship. The sheriff moved forward, and Sloan's composure finally cracked. You're making a mistake, Hart. I have friends in this territory, people who understand the value of the work I do. You can't. I can, and I am. Take him. What happened next moved fast. Sloan's men went for their weapons. The sheriff pulled his gun. Rafe shoved the children toward the house while stepping in front of them, and Wren grabbed Kit and Lena and hauled them backward as violence bloomed in the yard like brutal flowers. But before shots could be fired, Judge Hart's voice cracked like a whip. Stop, all of you, stop, or I'll add attempted murder to the charges. The men froze, caught between orders and self-preservation. The sheriff had his gun trained on the nearest one. Rafe had positioned himself as a human shield, and the judge stood in the middle, radiating the kind of authority that made even armed men reconsider their choices. You have two options, Hart said to Sloan's men. Surrender peacefully and cooperate with the investigation, or draw those weapons and guarantee yourselves a hanging. Choose. One by one, hands lifted away from guns. The fight went out of them as the arithmetic of consequences calculated itself behind their eyes. Sloan watched his operation collapse in real time, and the look on his face was pure fury wrapped in impotent rage. Sheriff Cole moved in with chains, and the sound of metal closing around wrists was the sweetest thing Wren had heard in her entire life. They loaded Sloan and his men into the wagon like cargo headed for judgment, chains clinking with each movement. The Reverend sat rigid, staring straight ahead with the kind of fury that comes from having power and watching it dissolve in your hands. His men looked variously scared, resigned, or calculating their odds of escape before they reached a proper jail. Judge Hart stood in the yard after the wagon pulled away, and the silence that followed felt heavy as the clouds overhead. Wren realized she was still holding Kit's hand tight enough to hurt, and when she loosened her grip, the boy didn't let go. How did you know? Rafe asked finally, voice rough from adrenaline draining away. About the forgery. I didn't. Not at first. Hart pulled off his hat, ran a hand through gray hair. But something about the timing bothered me. I grant guardianship one day, and the next morning Walsh supposedly issues an override? That's faster than the territorial bureaucracy has ever moved in recorded history. So I sent Sheriff Cole to verify, and when the telegram came back saying Walsh knew nothing about it, I rode hard enough to get here before Sloan could disappear with your children. Our children, Wren corrected quietly, surprising herself. He said ours. Rafe looked at her, and something shifted in his expression. Recognition, maybe, or acceptance of a truth that had been building for weeks. Yeah, he said. I did. Judge Hart studied them all. 7 children clustered close to one man who'd put himself between them and danger without hesitation, and nodded slowly. There will be a trial. Sloan's operation needs to be investigated properly. I'll need testimony from all of you about what happened here this morning. What about the other children? Mar's voice shook slightly. The ones already at his home, are they safe? Sheriff Cole is organizing a search warrant as we speak. By tomorrow morning, we'll have territorial marshals going through that facility with legal authority to remove any child being held against their will or subjected to abuse. Hart's face hardened. If Sloan was running what I think he was running, there will be consequences. Federal consequences, not just territorial. What happens to those kids after they're removed? Eli asked with his characteristic precision. Where do they go? That's complicated. Some may have family who can take them. Others will need placement. The territory has limited resources for orphan children, which is how men like Sloan find opportunities in the first place. The judge looked at Rafe. I don't suppose you'd consider... No. Rafe's answer came quick and certain. Not because I don't care, but because these 7 are all I can handle properly. Taking on more would mean doing right by none of them, and they deserve better than that. Hart nodded like he'd expected the answer. Fair enough. We'll figure something out. We always do, even if it's not perfect. He mounted his horse with the weariness of a man who'd been riding most of the night and still had a full day ahead. Mercer, keep those guardianship papers somewhere safe. I have a feeling there will be more challenges before this settles. Sloan had friends, and they won't appreciate their operation being exposed. We'll be ready, Rafe said. See that you are. These children have been through enough. They don't need more trauma added to it. Hart touched his hat brim in farewell. Miss Calder, you've got good instincts. Trust them. And if something feels wrong, you send word immediately. Don't wait for proof or permission. Wren nodded, throat tight with emotions she couldn't name. They watched the judge ride away, and when the dust settled, the 7 of them plus Rafe stood in the yard like survivors of a battle counting their wounds. Poppy started crying, the kind of wail that said she'd absorb the tension even if she couldn't understand it, and Mara bounced her gently while making soothing sounds. Inside, Rafe said. All of you. We need to talk. They gathered around the kitchen table, the same place they'd eaten celebration dinner just hours ago. It felt like years had passed since then, like they'd aged a decade in a single morning. Rafe put coffee on to boil even though most of them were too young for it, but the ritual of preparation gave him something to do with his hands. When he finally sat down, his face showed exhaustion and something deeper, the weight of responsibility made real through near catastrophe. I owe you all an apology. Boone frowned. For what? For not being ready, for thinking legal papers would be enough protection, for underestimating how far Sloan would go. Rafe's hands wrapped around his coffee cup. I should have anticipated this, should have had a plan beyond hoping the law would hold. You couldn't have known he'd forged documents, Eli pointed out logically. That's criminal behavior that assumes disregard for consequences. Most people don't operate at that level of calculated risk. Most people aren't running forced labor operations disguised as orphanages, Rafe countered. I knew he was dangerous. I should have been more prepared. You put yourself between us and armed men, Wren said quietly. You were ready enough. Getting myself killed wouldn't have helped you. But you were willing to. That's what matters. She met his eyes across the table. You were willing to die to keep us safe. That's not something we've had before. The words hung in the air, heavy with the weight of all the adults who'd failed them, abandoned them, sold them, or just plain stopped caring. Rafe looked at each of them, these 7 children who'd become his responsibility through a combination of chance and choice, and something in his face gentled. I meant what I said outside. You're my children now, not in blood, maybe not even in law when all the challenges are finished, but in the ways that matter. You're mine, and I'm yours, and I'll be damned before I let anyone take that away. Kit started crying, quiet tears that tracked down his face while he tried to hide them. Mara's eyes got bright. Even Boone looked away, blinking hard against emotions he wasn't ready to acknowledge. Lena stood from her chair, walked around the table, and did something she'd never done before. She put her arms around Rafe's neck and held on. Just held on, small and fierce, while he sat very still, like he was afraid moving might break whatever fragile trust had just been offered. Okay then, he said roughly. Okay. The days that followed were strange, caught between normalcy and waiting for the next crisis. They worked the ranch because work still needed doing. Fences didn't mend themselves, chickens still required feeding, and the garden Mara had started wouldn't grow without tending. But underneath the routine ran a current of tension, everyone listening for hoofbeats, watching for riders, waiting for whatever retaliation Sloan's friends might bring. News trickled in through Sheriff Cole's visits. The investigation at Sloan's facility had found conditions worse than anyone wanted to admit publicly. Children working 16-hour days, locked rooms, punishment cells, ledgers that showed children being rented out to local businesses as cheap labor while Sloan pocketed the wages. 18 children ranging from 6 to 15, all of them malnourished, most bearing scars that spoke to systematic abuse. Where are they now? Mara asked during one of the sheriff's updates. Temporary placement with local families while the territory sorts out long-term solutions. Some have relatives we're trying to locate. Others, he shrugged, the gesture encompassing all the impossible complexity of caring for traumatized children in a system with more needs than resources. "We're doing what we can." "That's not an answer," Boone said. "No," Cole agreed. "But it's all I've got right now." After he left, Wren found Rafe in the barn, working on leather again because it seemed to be what he did when thinking hard. "The trial's in 3 weeks." "I know. Judge Hart says we'll all have to testify, tell what happened that morning." She sat on a hay bale, watched his hands work the leather with practiced efficiency. "Tell what we saw at Sloane's place, too, those of us who were close enough to notice details." "You were the closest. You saw his eyes when the judge called him on the forgery." "I saw a man who thought he was untouchable realizing he wasn't. I saw someone who'd been running the same operation for years having it collapse in minutes." Wren paused. "I also saw that he's not alone. He mentioned friends, people who value his work." "I know." Rafe's hand stilled on the leather. "That's what worries me. Sloane's in jail, but the system that let him operate isn't, and systems protect themselves. So what do? We document everything. We make our case so clear that anyone trying to interfere looks either corrupt or incompetent. We prove that this arrangement works, that you're all better off here than in any institution the territory could provide." He looked at her, and his eyes held the kind of determination that came from having already lost one family and refusing to lose another. "And we trust that there are more good people than bad in positions that matter." That's optimistic. It's survival. Because the alternative is assuming we're beaten before we fight, and I'm not ready to surrender what we've built here. What they'd built became more visible in the weeks before trial. Eli invented a water pumping system that cut their work time by half. Mara's garden started producing enough vegetables to supplement their stores. Kit's chickens laid eggs so consistently they had surplus to trade in town. Boone built a new section of fence so straight it could have been drawn with a ruler. Lena spent hours with the horses, and under her quiet care Copper's coat gleamed and the other animals gentled to her touch in ways they wouldn't for anyone else. Wren kept her journal, documenting not just activities but transformations. Kit smiling more. Lena speaking in full sentences now, sometimes even volunteering thoughts without being asked. Mara humming while she cooked, the same songs their mother used to sing. Eli reading advanced mathematics because Rafe had found textbooks and encouraged learning beyond practical skills. Boone's anger smoothing into something more like determination, his suspicion evolving into protective vigilance. And Poppy, who'd been gray and dying in a wagon, now crawled across the floor chasing dust motes through sunlight, laughing with the pure joy of a child who'd never known anything but safety and love. The trial came with the weight of spectacle. Bridger Creek's courthouse couldn't hold everyone who wanted to attend, so they set up extra seating outside where people could listen through open windows. Wren recognized the dynamics immediately. This wasn't just about Sloane's crimes anymore. This was about whether the territory would admit its systems had failed, whether powerful men would face consequences, whether children's testimony would matter against adult authority. The prosecutor was a territorial attorney named Morrison, sharp-eyed and precise, who laid out the case with the methodical brutality of a surgeon removing corruption. Documents showing forged signatures. Testimony from the children rescued from Sloane's facility. Their words hitting like hammers against stone. Evidence of financial fraud. Money supposed to fund child welfare diverted to Sloane's personal accounts. Sloane's defense attorney, a smooth-talking man from back east, tried every angle. The children were lying, traumatized, and coached. The financial records were misinterpreted. The facility ran within territorial guidelines, and any issues were aberrations, not policy. His client was a man of faith trying to serve society's most vulnerable, now facing persecution for his charity. It might have worked, except for what happened on the third day when Wren took the stand. Morrison asked her to describe the morning Sloane came to the ranch. She walked through it. The 5 riders, the forged order, the attempted seizure. Her voice stayed level even when recounting how Rafe had stood between them and armed men, how close they'd come to being taken. Then Sloane's attorney stood for cross-examination, and his first question was delivered with practiced sympathy. "Miss Calder, isn't it true that you're desperate for stability? That after losing your parents and being abandoned by your wagon master, you'd be inclined to believe anyone who offered you safety?" "Yes," Wren said simply. The attorney blinked, thrown by the agreement. So you admit your judgment might be compromised by need? I admit I know what desperation looks like. I lived it. We all did. She looked at Sloan, sitting at the defense table with his carefully arranged expression of wounded innocence. That's why I recognize it in others. Why I can tell the difference between someone offering real help and someone exploiting need for profit. You're 14 years old. You can't possibly... I'm 14 years old and I've kept 6 children alive through circumstances that would break most adults. I've made decisions about food and water and safety every day for months. I've learned to read people because my life and theirs depended on it. Her voice got harder. So when Reverend Sloan showed up with forged papers and armed men, I knew exactly what I was looking at. Someone who thought children were property to be collected, not people to be protected. The courtroom went very quiet. Morrison was trying not to smile. The judge leaned forward slightly, attention fixed on Wren's face. Sloan's attorney regrouped. But how can you be certain the papers were forged? You're not a handwriting expert. I'm not, but Judge Hart verified it with the actual territorial administrator. That's what experts do. They check facts instead of assuming authority, make something true. You seem very hostile toward my client. I'm hostile toward anyone who tries to kidnap children. Doesn't seem that complicated to me. Objection, the attorney said, turning to the judge. The witness is being argumentative. The witness is answering your questions, Judge Hart said dryly. If you don't like the answers, ask better questions. The attorney tried a few more angles, but Wren had learned from watching the others testify. She kept her answers short, factual, and devastatingly clear. When he finally dismissed her, she walked back to her seat feeling like she'd fought a battle with nothing but words and won. The other children testified over the next 2 days. Eli with his precise recollection of events. Mara describing how Sloan's men had looked at Poppy like she was inventory instead of a baby. Even Lena took the stand and, in her quiet voice that still carried weight because it was so rarely used, said simply, "He scared me. Rafe doesn't." The children from Sloan's facility testified too, and their stories painted a picture so grim that even the defense attorney stopped trying to discredit them halfway through. 12-year-olds with backs scarred from beatings. 10-year-olds who'd worked in mine shafts too small for adults. 8-year-olds who flinched at sudden movements and couldn't make eye contact. The prosecution rested, and Morrison's closing argument was brief. The defense wants you to believe this is complicated. It's not. A man used legal authority to exploit children for profit. He forged documents to seize more children when the legal process didn't move fast enough for his needs. He built a system of abuse and called it charity. The only complicated thing here is how he got away with it for so long. Don't let him get away with it anymore. Sloan's attorney took longer, spinning webs of reasonable doubt and institutional benefit and good intentions gone awry. But his words felt hollow after the children's testimony, like trying to build a cathedral from spider silk. The jury deliberated for 2 hours. When they returned, the 4 women stood and delivered verdicts on 12 separate charges, and every single one came back the same: guilty. Sloan's face went white, then red, then settled into stone. The judge scheduled sentencing for the following week and remanded the defendant to territorial custody. As they let him out in chains, he looked at Rafe with pure hatred, and Wren understood that even from prison, a man like that could reach out and cause damage if he wanted to badly enough. The town celebrated that night like they'd won something communal, like exposing Sloan's corruption had cleansed a stain they'd all been living with. The saloon offered free drinks, the general store gave candy to children, and strangers congratulated Rafe on the street like he'd personally defeated evil instead of just protecting 7 kids who'd become his. But Wren noticed the people who didn't celebrate. The men who'd done business with Sloan, whose operations had benefited from cheap child labor. The territorial officials whose reputations were damaged by their failure to investigate sooner. The respectable citizens who'd donated to Sloan's home and now had to reconcile their charity with the reality of what it funded. Those people didn't congratulate Rafe. They watched him with calculation, and Wren knew they were the real danger. Sloan was defeated, but the system that enabled him was still intact, and systems defended themselves. Sentencing came a week later. Judge Hart gave Sloan 20 years at territorial prison, the maximum allowed under current law. He also issued orders for a comprehensive investigation of all territorial child welfare facilities, mandated quarterly inspections by independent reviewers, and established new oversight requirements for anyone working with orphaned or abandoned children. These reforms won't bring back the childhood stolen from Sloane's victims, Hart said from the bench. But perhaps they'll prevent future victims from suffering the same fate. That's the best justice we can offer, not revenge, but prevention. Outside the courthouse afterward, Morrison found Rafe and the children. "You did good in there," he told Wren. "All of you. Takes courage to stand up in front of a room full of adults and tell truth that makes powerful people uncomfortable." "Is it over?" Kit asked. "Really over?" Morrison hesitated, and in that pause, Wren heard the answer before he spoke it. "The trial's over. Sloane's going to prison. But changing a system takes longer than convicting one man. There will be resistance. Pushback from people who benefited from the old ways. You need to stay vigilant." "We will," Rafe said quietly. "We've gotten good at it." They rode home through afternoon sun that turned the grassland golden, and somewhere in that journey between town and ranch, between trial and whatever came next, Wren felt something shift. They'd won. Actually won. Not just survived, not just endured, but fought and won against forces that should have crushed them. It didn't erase the past, the deaths, the abandonments, the fear and hunger and desperate uncertainty, but it proved that the past didn't have to determine the future, that choices mattered, that 7 children and 1 grieving rancher could stand against corruption and come out the other side intact. When they reached the ranch, Rafe didn't go to the barn. He came inside with them, sat at the table while Mara cooked dinner, helped Eli with a mechanical problem, listened to Kit's excited chatter about the chickens, watched Lena describe Copper's training progress with words that came easier now. He held Poppy while Mara worked, and the baby grabbed his finger with the absolute trust of someone too young to remember when trust was dangerous. After dinner, Boone cleared his throat. Everyone looked up because Boone rarely initiated conversation, preferring to observe and calculate from the edges. "I was wrong about you," he said to Rafe. "Back at the start. I thought you'd turn on us eventually, that the kindness was a trap. I was wrong." Rafe set down his coffee cup carefully. "You were smart to be cautious. Nothing wrong with protecting yourself and the others. There's a difference between caution and refusing to see what's real." Boone's hands clenched into fists, then deliberately relaxed. "You're real. This is real, and I'm tired of waiting for it to fall apart, so I'm choosing to believe it won't." The words cost him. Wren could see that. Admitting wrong, expressing trust. These were currencies Boone spent carefully because he'd been bankrupted by belief before. But he offered them now, and Rafe accepted the gift with the gravity it deserved. "Thank you," Rafe said simply, "for giving this a real chance." That night, Wren wrote in her journal by lamplight while the others slept. She documented the trial, the verdict, the sentencing. But mostly, she wrote about the shift she felt happening, the way they were becoming something more than survivors. A family, maybe. Or at least the foundation one could be built on. The future still held uncertainty, winter approaching, challenges that would test them, the possibility that Sloane's allies might try for revenge or retribution. But they'd face it together, all 8 of them, and that made the uncertainty feel manageable instead of overwhelming. Outside her window, she could see lamplight burning in the barn, and she realized Rafe had gone back to his old sleeping spot despite everything. Some habits died hard, and maybe that was okay. Maybe trust was built slowly, through consistent action over time, not through single moments of decision. She closed the journal and climbed into bed beside Lena, who murmured in her sleep and curled closer to warmth and safety. Tomorrow would bring whatever it brought, work and learning and the slow, steady building of a life that felt like living instead of just surviving. For tonight, they were safe. They were together. And in a territory as hard as Montana, that was victory enough. Winter arrived early that year, bringing snow in October, and temperatures that turned morning water troughs to solid ice. Wren woke one morning to find frost patterns on the window glass and her breath visible in the bedroom air. Beside her, Lena and Mara burrowed deeper under quilts, and from the loft she could hear the boys moving around, their voices carrying through the floorboards. She dressed quickly, layering clothes the way Rafe had taught them, and went to start the fire. But someone had beaten her to it. Rafe stood at the stove, coffee already brewing, and when he turned at her footsteps, his face showed the kind of exhaustion that came from a night without sleep. "You okay?" she asked quietly. "Couldn't sleep, too much thinking." He poured coffee, handed her a cup without asking if she wanted it. "Judge Hart sent word yesterday. The Territorial Review Board wants to interview us again, all of us. They're doing a comprehensive assessment of the guardianship situation." Wren's stomach tightened. "Why?" "The trial's over. Sloane's in prison." "Because changing one verdict doesn't change institutional thinking. There are still people in the territorial government who think children like you belong in facilities, not ranches. They're using the Sloane case as justification for increased oversight." Rafe's voice carried frustration. "Which sounds good on paper, but in practice it means more scrutiny of arrangements like ours." "When do they want to see us?" 2 weeks, before the mountain pass is closed for winter." He sat heavily at the table. "Wren, I need you to understand something. This could go either way. They could look at what we've built here and approve it, make the guardianship permanent. Or they could decide that a single man raising 7 children on an isolated ranch isn't appropriate, and they could remove all of you to separate placements." The words hit like fists. Separate placements. The family they'd built scattered to different homes, different towns, different lives. Wren's hand shook enough that coffee sloshed over the cup rim. "We won't let that happen." "We might not have a choice." Rafe's honesty was brutal because it was kind. He wouldn't lie to her about the stakes. "The law gives them authority to decide what's in your best interest, and sometimes the law is an ass." The others emerged gradually, drawn by the smell of coffee and the sound of voices. When everyone was gathered, Rafe explained the situation with the same directness he'd shown Wren. Kit's face crumpled. Mara held Poppy tighter. Eli's expression went calculating, probably already working through legal precedents and bureaucratic procedures. Boone's jaw set in that way that said he was preparing for a fight. Lena spoke into the heavy silence. "We're a family. They can't just decide we're not." "Legally, they can decide almost anything," Rafe's voice gentled. "But Lena's right about what matters. We are a family. Not by blood, not by traditional standards, but by choice and commitment and the work we've done to build something real here. We just need to make the review board see that." "How?" Mara asked. "Same way we convinced Judge Hart. We document everything. We show them the evidence of what we've accomplished. And we tell our truth so clearly they can't ignore it." They spent the next 2 weeks preparing like soldiers before battle. Eli created detailed records of educational progress, reading levels, mathematics proficiency, practical skills acquired. Mara documented nutrition, showing meal plans and health improvements with the precision of a scientist. Wren expanded her journal to include specific examples of emotional development, conflict resolution, the daily proof that they were thriving. They cleaned the house until it gleamed, repaired anything that looked worn or broken, made sure the livestock were healthy and the building sound, created the visible evidence of a functioning household where children were cared for properly. But underneath the preparation ran a current of fear, because documentation and evidence might not matter if the review board had already decided that conventional family structures were the only acceptable ones. The officials arrived on a gray November morning, 3 of them in a territorial wagon with official seals. 2 men and a woman, all dressed in formal city clothes that looked absurd against the ranch's rough functionality. The woman introduced herself as Mrs. Adelaide Fletcher, head of the Territorial Child Welfare Board. The men were Mr. Gaines and Mr. Thornton, administrators whose exact roles remained vague, but whose authority felt oppressively real. They spent 3 days at the ranch, observing everything. Mrs. Fletcher watched Mara cook, asked detailed questions about nutrition and meal planning. Mr. Gaines inspected the sleeping arrangements, measured rooms, checked window locks like he was cataloging security features. Mr. Thornton interviewed each child separately, his questions probing for signs of abuse, coercion, or inappropriate behavior. Wren sat across from him in the room that had become an interrogation space and answered with the same directness she'd shown at trial. "Are you happy here, Miss Calder?" "Yes." "Do you feel you're missing educational opportunities that a proper school could provide?" "I'm learning more here than I ever did in school. Practical skills, mechanical principles, animal husbandry, household management, plus Rafe has books on mathematics, history, literature. I read every night." But wouldn't you prefer the company of children your own age, friends, social interaction beyond your siblings? Ren considered the question carefully. I have 6 siblings who depend on me. I have work that matters and an adult who treats me with respect. I have safety, food, warmth, and a future that looks better than my past. Friends are nice, but they're not worth giving up what we have here. Thornton made notes, his face revealing nothing. Some would argue that a young woman needs female guidance, instruction in domestic arts, proper behavior, preparation for marriage, and motherhood. Mara's learning domestic arts every day. I'm learning to shoot, ride, mend fence, and make decisions that keep people alive. Both of us are being prepared for futures we choose, not futures someone else thinks we should want. You're very confident for 14. I've been making life and death decisions since I was 12. Confidence isn't optional when people are counting on you. She saw something flicker in his expression. Surprise, maybe, or reassessment. He asked a few more questions, but the edge had gone out of them, and when he dismissed her, Ren felt like maybe she'd won another small battle. The evenings were hardest. The officials ate dinner with them, observing family dynamics with the cold assessment of scientists studying specimens. Conversation felt stilted, artificial, everyone too aware of being watched. Even Poppy seemed to sense the tension, fussing more than usual while Mara tried to keep her quiet. On the 3rd night, after the children had gone to bed, Ren found Mrs. Fletcher sitting alone at the kitchen table, papers spread in front of her. The woman looked up when Ren entered, and something in her face suggested she'd been expecting company. Can't sleep either? Mrs. Fletcher asked. Too much worry. Ren poured herself water, stayed standing. Are you going to take us away from here? The directness seemed to surprise the woman, but she didn't deflect. I haven't decided yet. The situation is complicated. It's not complicated. We're thriving here. We're healthy, educated, cared for. What's complicated about that? The complication is that you're 7 children being raised by a single man with no wife, no female presence, in an isolated location miles from town. Those factors create vulnerabilities that concern the board. Vulnerabilities like what? That we might learn to be self-sufficient? That we might grow up understanding that worth comes from what you do, not who you're related to? Ren's voice got harder. Or are you worried that we're not being molded into proper society's expectations? Mrs. Fletcher's expression sharpened. I'm worried that in 5 years, when you're 19 and your brothers and sisters are older, you'll look back and resent that you spent your youth raising other people's children instead of living your own life. The observation hit close to truth, but Ren had learned the difference between uncomfortable truth and actual harm. They're not other people's children. They're my family. And yes, I'm sacrificing some things other girls my age take for granted, but I'm gaining things they'll never understand: purpose, capability, the knowledge that I can handle whatever life throws at me. That seems like a fair trade. You're remarkably articulate about your choices. Most 14-year-olds haven't thought this through so carefully. Most 14-year-olds haven't had to. I did, and I'd make the same choice every time, because the alternative is letting bureaucrats who've never met us decide our lives based on regulations written by people who've never faced real hardship. Mrs. Fletcher was quiet for a long moment. Then she said, "Tell me honestly, if we approved permanent guardianship, what would your future look like? 5 years from now, 10 years from now?" Ren sat down, sensing this was the real question, the one everything else had been building toward. 5 years from now? I'll be 19. Eli will be 14, old enough to handle more responsibility. Mara will be 16, probably better at cooking than most professional cooks. Boone will be 17, strong and skilled enough to work anywhere. The younger ones will be growing into themselves. And I'll probably still be here, helping Rafe run the ranch, making sure everyone's okay. Maybe thinking about my own future, but not at the expense of theirs. That sounds like sacrifice. It sounds like family. You take care of the people you love, even when it's hard, especially when it's hard. Ren leaned forward. Mrs. Fletcher, I know this doesn't look like a normal family. I know it breaks rules about proper households and conventional arrangements, but it works. We work. And tearing us apart to satisfy bureaucratic standards would be the cruelest thing you could do, not because it would hurt Rafe, but because it would destroy 7 children who finally found stability. The woman studied her face with an intensity that felt like being x-rayed. You really believe that? I know that. I've lived the alternative. Institutions, temporary placements, adults who saw us as obligations instead of people. This is better. We're better. And if you can't see that after 3 days watching us, then the problem isn't our family structure. It's your metrics for measuring success. Mrs. Fletcher gathered her papers slowly. Get some sleep, Miss Calder. Tomorrow we'll make our final observations and begin deliberations. Wren climbed the stairs to her room, knowing she'd said everything she could. The rest was out of her hands, subject to the judgment of people who valued conformity over reality. She lay in bed listening to Lena and Mara breathe and tried not to imagine a future where they were separated, scattered like seeds to different winds. Morning brought the officials' final inspection. They gathered everyone in the main room, and Mrs. Fletcher took the lead, her voice formal and prepared. Over the past 3 days, we've observed this household extensively. We've reviewed educational records, health documentation, living conditions, and family dynamics. We've interviewed each child individually and assessed Mr. Mercer's capabilities as a guardian. She paused, and in that silence, Wren heard their entire future hanging in balance. Our findings are mixed. On one hand, the children show remarkable development and clear attachment to Mr. Mercer and each other. Educational progress exceeds standard expectations. Physical health is excellent. Living conditions, while rustic, are safe and appropriate. Wren's heart lifted fractionally, but Mrs. Fletcher wasn't finished. However, concerns remain about the unconventional nature of this arrangement. A single man raising 7 children, particularly as the girls approach adolescence, creates situations that could be problematic. The isolation of the ranch limits social development and access to community resources. And while current circumstances appear positive, we must consider long-term sustainability. So what does that mean? Boone asked, voice tight with controlled anger. Mrs. Fletcher looked at each of them in turn. It means we're recommending conditional permanent guardianship. Mr. Mercer retains custody, but with specific requirements. First, quarterly inspections by territorial officials to ensure continued appropriate care. Second, mandatory schooling during winter months when weather permits travel to town. Third, engagement with community resources including church, social events, and civic participation. And if we don't meet those conditions, Rafe's voice stayed level, then guardianship will be reconsidered. But Mr. Mercer, I want to be clear, we're not setting these conditions to create obstacles. We're creating accountability structures that will protect both you and the children from future challenges. If other officials question this arrangement, you'll have documented proof of compliance with territorial standards. Wren understood this strategy. Mrs. Fletcher was giving them approval while building political cover for her decision. The conditions were reasonable, even beneficial, and they provided justification against anyone who might later try to reverse the guardianship. We can meet those requirements, Rafe said. Gladly. Mr. Thornton spoke for the first time that morning. I'll note for the record that in 20 years of child welfare work, I've rarely seen children this well-adjusted after the trauma you 7 have experienced. Whatever Mr. Mercer is doing, it's working. Don't let bureaucratic perfectionism destroy something that actually functions. The words carried weight because they came from someone who clearly hadn't wanted to be convinced, but was honest enough to acknowledge reality. They left that afternoon, official papers signed and sealed, taking with them the power to unmake what had been built, but choosing instead to protect it. Wren watched their wagon disappear down the road and felt tension drain from muscles she hadn't realized were clenched. We won, Kit said, voice small with wonder. We actually won. We survived, Rafe corrected gently. Winning is what we do with the time we've bought. He was right, Wren knew. The approval was a beginning, not an ending. They still had to fulfill the conditions, prove themselves continuously, demonstrate that unconventional could still mean successful. But for the first time since the wagon broke down and the wagon master abandoned them, the future felt like something they could build instead of something they had to endure. Winter deepened, and the ranch took on the rhythm of survival in Montana cold. They learned to break ice on water troughs, to bank fires for maximum heat efficiency, to move livestock to sheltered areas before storms hit. The work was hard and constant, but it was their work, done for their benefit, and that made all the difference. Schooling happened around the kitchen table on days too cold for outside work. Rafe taught mathematics using ranch problems. How much hay did they need to feed 3 horses through winter? How many eggs would 6 chickens produce over 3 months? If fence cost 50 cents per linear foot, what would replacing the north pasture boundary run? Eli devoured physics and engineering texts, building models to understand principles of leverage, force, and mechanical advantage. Mara read novels and poetry, discovering that stories could transport you beyond immediate circumstances. Boone struggled with formal learning but excelled at practical application. He could calculate board feet of lumber needed for a project faster than Eli could write the equation. Lena learned through the horses, and Rafe taught her not just riding, but anatomy, behavior, the subtle communication between human and animal that couldn't be reduced to words. She spoke more now, full sentences that carried thought and feeling, and watching her transformation felt like witnessing a resurrection. Kit grew 3 inches that winter, shot up so fast his pants became too short, and his voice started cracking. He took on more responsibility with the livestock, proving himself capable and careful. Poppy learned to walk, taking her first steps across the kitchen floor while everyone watched and cheered like she'd accomplished something miraculous, which, in a way, she had. And Wren found herself changing too, the constant crisis management giving way to something calmer. She still kept her journal, still watched for threats, but the vigilance felt less like survival instinct and more like healthy caution. She caught herself laughing at Kit's jokes, teasing Boone about his crush on the blacksmith's daughter, helping Mara plan recipes instead of just documenting nutrition. She was becoming a person instead of just a protector, and the realization felt both strange and right. Spring brought the territorial inspectors, just as promised. They spent 2 days reviewing records, interviewing children, observing operations. Their report noted excellent progress in all metrics and recommended continuation of guardianship without modification. Summer came with cattle drives and fence repairs and the hard work of maintaining a ranch that was finally starting to feel less like a refuge and more like a home. They hired on extra hands during peak season, and Wren noticed how Rafe introduced them. "My children," he'd say, casual but clear, establishing relationship and expectation. The autumn inspection brought different officials, but the pattern remained the same: observation, documentation, approval. The quarterly visits became routine, predictable, eventually just another rhythm in their year like planting or harvest. Years passed with the steady accumulation of seasons. Wren turned 16, then 17, growing into someone she almost didn't recognize in the mirror, confident, capable, certain of her place in the world. Boone became a man, tall and strong, choosing to stay on the ranch even when opportunities elsewhere beckoned because, as he said simply, "This is home." Eli went to study engineering at Territorial College, funded by scholarships and a loan from Rafe that he insisted on repaying even though Rafe just as strongly insisted it was family money, and families didn't track debts. Mara married a neighboring rancher's son, moved 5 miles away but came home weekly with her husband in tow because blood family and chosen family both mattered. Kit discovered a gift for veterinary work, apprenticing with the town doctor who handled both human and animal patients. Lena became a horse trainer whose reputation spread across 3 territories: gentle hands and patient understanding, producing results that harsher methods couldn't match. And Poppy, the baby who'd almost died from heat and dehydration in a broken wagon, grew into a fierce, joyful child who loved hard and laughed freely and never knew a day when she wasn't absolutely certain she was loved. Wren stayed on the ranch through her 20th birthday, helping Rafe manage operations that had expanded with success. They took in 3 more orphaned children over the years, siblings left behind when influenza killed their mother and grandfather in the same week. And the process that had seemed so fraught with Wren's group felt almost natural this time. She was there the day Judge Hart rode out to deliver news. He was older now, retirement approaching, but his eyes were as sharp as ever. They sat on the porch in autumn sun while he explained that the territorial legislature was passing new child welfare laws, reforms directly inspired by the Sloan case and the success of their arrangement. "They're calling them the Mercer Standards," Hart said with something that might have been a smile. "Requirements for facilities housing orphan children, oversight protocols, inspection schedules, all designed to prevent another Sloan from operating unchecked." "That's good," Rafe said quietly. That matters. It does. You changed the system, Mercer. You and these children. Not by complaining about how things were, but by proving how things could be. Hart stood, prepared to leave. That's rare. Most people just accept that systems are broken and work around the damage. You fix something. After he left, Wren sat with Rafe in comfortable silence, watching the sun set over land they'd worked and protected and made productive through years of effort. Did you ever imagine it would turn out like this? She asked. That morning you found us in the wagon? Rafe was quiet for a long moment. I imagined getting you somewhere safe, getting the baby medical attention, maybe helping you figure out where to go next. He paused. I didn't imagine family, didn't think I'd get another chance at that after losing my brother. You saved us. We saved each other. I was dying just as surely as Poppy was, just slower and quieter. You gave me purpose again, reason to wake up, reminded me that living and surviving aren't the same thing. Wren understood that truth in her bones. They'd all been surviving before, getting through days, avoiding disasters, hoping for something better without believing it would come. But they'd learned to live here, to build instead of just endure, to choose their future instead of just accepting whatever came. That winter, Wren told Rafe she'd been offered a teaching position in town. The new school needed someone who understood both academic subjects and practical skills, someone who could teach children from ranch families that education mattered beyond books. You should take it, Rafe said without hesitation. It's a good opportunity. It would mean leaving the ranch, living in town. It would mean growing into your own life instead of staying attached to mine. That's not leaving, that's living. She took the position, moved to town, taught children whose circumstances reminded her of her own. But she came home every weekend because home was still the ranch, still the family they'd built from desperation and choice. The years continued their steady march. Rafe aged into his 50s with grace, gray spreading through his hair, but his strength remaining. The children grew, scattered to their own lives but stayed connected through bonds forged in shared struggle and sustained through deliberate choice. When Rafe died at 68, quick and clean, heart failure in the barn while working on leather just like he'd always done, all 7 of them came home for the funeral. They stood together in the cemetery on the hill overlooking the ranch and remembered the man who'd chosen them when choosing was dangerous, who'd protected them when protection meant risking everything, who'd loved them not because he had to, but because he wanted to. Wren, 34 now, and principal of the regional school, spoke at the service. She told the truth simply. Family isn't blood. It's not law or obligation or tradition. It's the people who see you struggling and choose to help. The people who stand between you and danger. The people who believe you're worth fighting for even when the whole world says you're not. Rafe Mercer was family to 7 children who had none. And because of that, we got to become the people we were meant to be instead of the broken people circumstances tried to make us. They scattered his ashes on the ranch he'd loved, and in the weeks that followed, they made decisions about what came next. The ranch went to Boone, who'd never wanted to leave and who ran it with the same steady competence Rafe had shown. But they all owned pieces of it emotionally, all contributed to its maintenance and success. Years later, when Wren was 40 and teaching her second generation of students, a young girl appeared in her office, 12 years old, recently orphaned, placed with a distant aunt who didn't want her. The girl's eyes held the same desperate wariness Wren remembered from mirrors 2 decades past. Miss Calder? The girl said, voice small. The principal said you might understand, said you'd been where I am. Wren looked at this child carrying burdens too heavy for small shoulders, and she understood that the circle wasn't complete, that the salvation she'd received from Rafe demanded paying forward, demanded extending the same grace to others that had been extended to her. I do understand, she said gently, and I'm going to help you, not because I have to, because I want to, because that's what family does. The girl's eyes filled with tears, and Wren came around the desk to kneel beside her chair. You're going to be okay. I promise you that. It might not feel like it now, but there are people who care, who'll fight for you, who'll make sure you have what you need to survive and thrive. I'm one of those people, and I'm not giving up on you. She thought about Rafe, about that morning in the desert when he'd offered water and safety and eventually became the father none of them had thought they'd have again. She thought about all the mornings since, the slow accumulation of days that became years, the work and struggle and joy of building something real from broken pieces. And she understood that this was the true victory. Not just that they'd survived, but that they'd learned to pass on what they'd received. That the family Rafe built didn't end with his death, but continued through everyone they touched, everyone they helped, everyone who learned from their example that love was a choice you made and kept making. The girl stopped crying eventually, wiped her face, looked at Ren with tentative hope. "You really think I'll be okay?" "I know you will, because you're strong enough to ask for help, and that's the hardest part. Everything else we can figure out together." Outside the window, Montana stretched vast and beautiful under autumn sun. The same sun that had beaten down on 7 desperate children in a broken wagon all those years ago. The land was hard and the winters were brutal, and survival demanded everything you had and then some. But it was also a place where broken people could heal, where unconventional families could thrive, where grace existed in the spaces between law and tradition if you were brave enough to claim it. Ren stood, offered her hand to the girl, and together they walked toward whatever came next. Behind them, invisible but present, stretched a line of people who'd chosen to help when helping was hard. Rafe first and always, but also Judge Hart, Mrs. Fletcher, Sheriff Cole, and everyone who'd decided that protecting children mattered more than protecting systems. And ahead of them stretched possibility, the chance to write new stories, to build new families, to prove again and again that the best definition of home wasn't the place you were born, but the people who chose to keep you, and the choice you made to keep them right back. The circle continued, unbroken and expanding. And somewhere in the spaces between heartbeats and history, Rafe's legacy lived on. Not in monuments or accolades, but in the quiet, steady way that love multiplied when given freely and received with gratitude. Family, it turned out, was the most durable thing humans could build, more lasting than stone, more valuable than gold, more powerful than any law written by distant authorities who'd never faced real hardship. Family was 7 children and 1 grieving rancher choosing each other against all odds and all opposition, and making that choice matter through years of work and struggle and absolute, unshakable commitment. Family was everything, and it was enough.